Hi, Tish. Welcome to the sisterhood.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Well, we are so glad to have you. And I feel like we have to get one thing off the table before we jump in and talk about the topic of the day. Can you tell us about your first name?
It is not misspelled, and that is my full name on my birth certificate. I guess I get asked this all the time. The best explanation I can give is that it was the 70s, and my parents were in an experimental mood, and my father was reading a novel where a U.S. pilot crash lands in the Soviet Union, and he develops a love interest towards a woman named Tsh. So it is a Russian name, but I have since been to Russia and it's rare even there. So it's not a common Russian name. Either.
Okay.
But that is the explanation. And it's not because I have, Russian ancestry or anything. It was just my parents were in a mood. So,
okay. Yeah. I have wondered if it was a given name.
It is my given name. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, yay for your parents and yay for parents in the 70s because we all had them. Yeah. And I think it's pretty common for our listeners too, that we know that brings with it a whole bunch of stories.
Yep.
That we go into, but we won't today. Tish, we are talking with you today because you have a new book out about Lent. And Lent can feel like a 4-letter word in that people either don't like it, they kind of recoil and say, ooh, that's about rules and legalism. Or they can say, it's a 4-letter word because I don't understand it. And so it's scary and it feels weird to me. So we are going to normalize Lent. How's that for a goal?
Yeah.
Can you just talk to us? Give us an overview of what is Lent and why should we care about it?
Yeah, those responses are very common, especially here in the United States, or at least in the modern Western church in general, because it is actually a very old practice. And we have, probably in the past 100 years, slowly backed away from a lot of these ancient practices that most Christians throughout its 2,000-year history have just been innately familiar with. However, I will say I see a resurging trend towards some of that, like a newfound interest in a lot of these ancient practices, which makes me happy, of course. But the easy way, or maybe I should say the most straightforward way to explain Lent is to kind of back up in time a little bit about 6 to 8 weeks before that and talk about Advent. And the reason I say that is because Advent is the new year of what's called the liturgical calendar. This is the historic church calendar that recognizes more or less the new year as the first Sunday of Advent, which is for the 4 Sundays until Christmas. Christmas is then a Christmastide, 12 full days. And then we have Epiphany, followed by a season, depending on which tradition you're from. Sometimes Christmas is considered all the way to February 2nd. Others consider it as a form of ordinary time. But then we go into the season that is kind of this in-between time leading up until Easter, which is, obviously in the spring, later in the spring in the Northern Hemisphere. But if you walk back Easter 6 weeks or 46 days before then, we get Ash Wednesday. Ash Wednesday is officially the first day of Lent. And it is, Lent is a 40-day season between Ash Wednesday and Easter. Even though it's 46 days in length, it is a 40-day season because every Sunday within that is considered sort of a break, kind of a mini feast or a mini break from the fast. So that is like the 101 bird's eye view of what we're talking about here. And I could get into the whole history of the liturgical calendar, but that would take like days and days. Essentially, what this is a way the church marked time. The church marked time in tandem with the seasons that God had just instituted as part of our creation, where we have harvest seasons and planting seasons and all that good stuff that honestly most cultures were just very aware of until our modern era, where we can kind of separate ourselves from that. And so the church marked time in tandem with nature and with the seasons. And so this time of year, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, was seen as a time of slow renewal. Like it's, Ash Wednesday starts in many ways in the dead of winter, right? Mm-hmm. When it's been a couple months of winter, people are starting to feel, or totally, completely have felt that itch for spring, but it's not here yet. And so there is that little bit of a death. And then when we recognize, obviously, Easter, the resurrection of Christ, the church wanted to recognize kind of that in between season where we're walking from the dead of winter into full on spring, where we've kind of joined in tandem the resurrection of new life in Christ. So I say all that to say that's the high view of it. We have records as far as the 2nd century. So we're talking like 150 AD roughly of Christians remarking on Lent in terms of an assumed practice within their communities. Sometimes it's easy for us to forget that the Christian tradition and culture was birthed from the Jewish culture, and that they were very well familiar with feast days and season and practices and traditions like this that involved the entire community. So it would only make sense that the early Christians would also adopt these same sort of concepts. So that is the basic idea of Lent, leading for those 40 days before Easter. Now, a lot of people know of Lent mostly as like the time when you fast from something, or the time, even more simplistic, when you give up something, and it tends to be something you like and
something fun.
And it tends to be, I don't want to be flippant about it, but a lot of us kind of take it as a sort of like, well, it's probably going to be good for me if I learn to live without chocolate for 6 weeks. So I'm going to just give it a go. And that's about the extent of it. We're not necessarily connecting it to anything more than like almost like a dare or a challenge, and while I understand the kind of the intention on doing that, the innate practices of Lent, when you look at really culturally and historically what Christians did for Lent, or the reasons why they did what they did, it makes so much more sense really in conjunction with what we're celebrating on Easter. So that's, it really does help to keep Lent in mind with the entire Christian calendar in mind, instead of just thinking of it as this one weird 6-week practice that doesn't seem to have any connection with anything else.
Mm-hmm. You used 2 words in your description together that I wonder if they kind of capture the spirit of Lent, and that was not yet.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of the spirit of we're remembering that Christ is coming, but he has not yet come?
Well, what's funny is Advent is famously known as the not yet season, right? Because we're recognizing that Christ was born 2,000 years ago, but we're also waiting for his second coming. And so there is an anticipatory feeling towards Advent as we're also waiting for Christmas. There is a very similar parallel with Advent and Lent. Both of them are, Advent isn't quite as penitential, but there is a little bit of that sense. Lent is much more so. And so with that comes just the inevitable pregnant anticipation of waiting for fulfillment, like the fullness of Christ's resurrection. And so, in the same similar way, we recognize that Christ already has risen. So when we're going through Lent, when we're waiting for Easter, we're not like pretending like we don't know what's going to happen. In the same way, when we go to a Good Friday service, we're recognizing Christ's crucifixion, but we always have that in the back of our minds, the bit of hope that we already know what's coming on Easter Sunday. However, the early, the disciples and the apostles, they did not know, and so we're joining them and remembering in real time during Holy Week what it must have felt like to just really and truly have to trust Jesus's words as true. And so we're kind of walking with that ancient reminder that even though we have already been saved through Christ's resurrection, we're not in our glorified state yet because we live in a broken world. Life, especially when we're tying in the concept of a fast with Lent, we're remembering our fragile bodies. Lent is not something to perfect or to get right, or even to like check boxes of as having done, because we are going to mess up. And that's because we're humans who live in imperfect bodies in an imperfect world. And so by embodying those fasts, we're remembering what we've been saved from and saved for, and that we have something to look forward to, that we we are one day going to be freed from these temporal bodies where, we are going to be invited to a feast, which, hopefully has all sorts of, chocolate and the carbs that people tend to fast from. We won't need to do we won't need to do those things anymore because the world has been renewed because of Christ that we recognize on Easter. Yeah.
That resonates so much, just that brokenness that we feel because it is not yet. And I would love to hear, Tsh, just your own journey through Lent and what it's done to your heart, and maybe give us, an example of what you've done and how it's impacted you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you're like me, and what I think a lot of people in the US are like, I didn't grow up knowing much about Lent or anything, or about the liturgical calendar at all. I had heard of the words Lent and Advent, but they always seemed either ancient or just kind of out there, not for me really. And so it wasn't like I had a disdain for Lent. I had a no opinion of Lent because it just wasn't part of my vernacular or part of my tradition growing up. So I wasn't really participating in any form of Lent until I was an adult. And my introduction to Lent came by way of Advent. And, I'll spare all those details, but it came from being a mom with young kids and wanting to incorporate some of the fun parts of Advent. And that gave me an introduction to the liturgical calendar at large. And then, understanding that the season of Lent actually is part of that. And it's not just this made up recently by some people who wanted to add more burdens to our plate kind of practice, that this is a very old thing that I could participate in. So I didn't really participate in any form of Advent until roughly 10 years ago, maybe even more recent than that. And just like a lot of people, it started with a simple, I think I should give up something for Lent and just see what all the fuss is about, or see what it is that people are doing and why this matters. And like a lot of people, it tended to be one of those things that was like great for the first few weeks. And then the thing that's different about Lent and Advent is that it's long, right? I mean, it's over 6 weeks long. You get tired of not having fill in the blank or whatever it is. And so I would peter out and that was great. I'm grateful for God's grace. And that this isn't a rubric for my worth. Right. And so it was all the things that people typically think of, fasting from sugar, fasting from caffeine, fasting from whatever. But I didn't really have any reason behind it other than a personal challenge. And honestly, for a little bit more of like the immediate, more physical benefits, like I would like to be free from being addicted by caffeine physically. Like I would like to see, that kind of thing. So those were my honest motives, right? But it wasn't until about 5 years ago when I really started connecting with this idea of maybe God is asking me to fast from something for reasons beyond just personal benefit in the here and now. Perhaps fasting, because I knew that fasting was in the Bible and had been talked about. So I was familiar with the idea, but perhaps fasting is more than just earthly gain, that perhaps there is something that God wants to teach me through the intentional giving up of something that I love. And so I started exploring a little bit, I guess, more deeply, the idea of fasting, not for my own volition, but legitimately, what does God want me to fast from? And it sounds kind of trite, but it was as simple as that. Like, maybe I should pray about this. Maybe I should ask God, what do you want me to fast from? And when I started doing that, that's when it really became so much more sacramental, embodied, so that it wasn't just something that I would just try to do as a personal challenge, but it was something that God was using to speak to me through. So, for example, there was about 5 years ago or so, I fasted. There was a year I fasted from complaining. So complaining isn't something like chocolate or coffee, which is like, I want it. It's like, no, I actually don't want to complain. That complaining is, that's not good. But as soon as I started doing it, I realized how I kind of did like to complain. And that was staring me square in the face, like, oh no, I am doing exactly what I don't want to do, a la Paul in Romans, like, oh gosh, I don't want to complain. And yet here I am complaining as a crutch all the time. And typical of so many things in life, as soon as you pray for the grace to find the strength to do something, you're given all sorts of opportunities to practice that, right?
Yeah.
You're given a workout. And so there were all sorts of reasons to complain. And it was just like, oh my goodness. And God really, really taught me a lot through that Lenten season. The other thing that I think has really been helpful for me is to remember that Lent really isn't just about fasting. Historically, there's 3 pillars as part of fasting. Lent, there's fasting, but then there's also prayer and almsgiving or giving, and I find that Lent as a season ends up being more meaningful, both to me, but also as a mom, with my kids, when we do it in tandem, whenever I try to tie those 3 things together into one kind of idea that I feel like God is leading us through as a family. So a few years ago, I fasted from sugar and encourage the kids to fast from some form of like something they like to eat that they wanted to give to God as a gift. But in tandem, that's when we first planted our vegetable garden. So it was a form of adding something in Thanksgiving, in prayer, as a work of prayer. And it was a really beautiful kind of embodiment of this process, because it was late winter, early spring, when you're really seeing new life, literally, growing. It's when you're outside in nature in tandem with the season. And then we also tied in our giving with a ministry that gives to situations involving food insecurity. So we tied it all together. And so for me, the past few years, that's also what's really made it more meaningful.
How old are your kids?
My kids now are almost 17, 14, and 11. So I'm in that middle stage with teens and a tween.
Yeah. And how was their buy-in, and what has that looked like, just trying to incorporate your family?
I would say that they are not fully bought in.
Yeah.
Because they are kids. And if anything, they tend to be gung-ho the first few days, because it feels like a challenge. It feels like you're going to dare me to, go without whatever. Let me show you that I can. And then the interest peters out. That is okay with me. Because how am I that much different, really? Right. And so we talk about it. That's one of the reasons my book was written, because I find to be the same with Advent, because it has a companion book, for Advent. Talking about it regularly, just a little bit of a time, makes them aware of the season, but in a low pressure. The last thing I would ever want to do is give my kids the impression that being a Christian involves proving your mettle to God, as though that's how God deems us worthy. That's, the sheer opposite of Easter, right? And so I would never want them to connect the dots with that, but I also want them to see that the here and now is not all there is, and yet God has put us here in our earthly bodies, and he perhaps wants to teach us things through these bodies of ours, and perhaps we should give the opportunity. That said, it always does end up kind of a game at first, and then it becomes less of an interest for a while. I find tying in things like giving and adding something to our fast helps when it comes to kids, especially when they're younger and they needed something more tangible. So there was a time when we fasted from, I'll use another example from a friend. They fasted from electric light during the day. And so they only turned on electricity. I think it was electricity, actually, not just electric light. I don't remember exactly. We live in Texas where it doesn't get very cold, so we could do that. But
I'm picturing what that looks like.
Me too.
Wow. Yeah. It's 77 today. So yeah. So they tied in fasting from that and only turning on electricity in the evening, but then they tied in learning at the dinner table just a little bit about different areas of the world that don't have basic needs like running water and electricity and just basic infrastructure, and they channeled some of their giving that way. And so they used it as kind of a teaching tool, but not in a dogmatic, feel badly for having electricity way. It's almost like joining in the rest of the church, the most of the world, in our daily lives, and to show that these little things really are blessings and they really do matter. Our little choices do matter. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask you about, because you have traveled so much. And in other countries, Easter is a much bigger deal than it is here in the US.
Yep.
How have you seen Easter celebrated or Lent recognized in ways in other parts of the world that has felt inspiring to you?
I think, two big differences is a lot of these countries are literally older than ours. And so they just have more of a direct tradition they can point to, like that cathedral is 1,000 years old and it's in our village. So they have more of a direct connection with what the ancient church would practice. The other way is that we kind of shelter ourselves from the seasons here, intentionally or not. But if you look at the structure of our environments, a lot of suburbs, people just drive right into their garages and you don't really spend a lot of time outside. And we have so much climate control. We don't even, at the click of a button, we're either not cold or not hot, and it's fine. And while that's not to say we're bad people at all, this is just the way our culture is. We are bereft with the opportunity to appreciate the seasons that we're really in. And so we might not recognize the beauty of going from winter to spring like some other culture does, or what most of human history was like before. Our ancestors here in the US 100 years ago felt that so much more, right? The glory of spring, the glory of renewal of life. And so I find that to be just the case with a lot of cultures. Now, that's not to disparage ours and, put a shiny lens on other places as though it's perfect, because it's not at all. But I do find that there's a little bit more of an intentionality in recognizing the season of Lent leading to Easter in certain places, just because they can literally feel it, and because their communities are smaller, smaller villages or smaller towns. And so you're just more aware of the world around you and what, your neighbor's doing, what your, the farm near your house is doing and participating in. Yeah.
I really, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about just the senses and how, people were just more in tune with all the senses playing into, whether it's the smells and the feeling of cold or the feeling of warmth, and what they're tasting even as spring comes, and, all those things which we can move in and out of depending on how intentional that we are, because we do have a more fabricated, society that we can live in whatever we choose. And so I really like that idea of kind of involving the senses a little bit more. I'm wondering if you have just intentionally or unintentionally done that with your family.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, that's one of the reasons the book is called Bitter and Sweet, right? It's because in the winter, logistically speaking, we shouldn't have access to things like sweet fruits. We do because we are divorced from those seasons now, right? We can get tomatoes year round, even though we're completely unaware that they are very much a summer fruit, right? But yeah, if we embody small practices in our home that just kind of play into that, because we have to be intentional now. Things like eating with the seasons, maybe eating more locally, because that makes eating with the seasons easier. For example, if you go to the farmer's market, they're not going to have strawberries in the dead of winter, right? Because they literally can't grow them unless you're just in the environment for that. And so perhaps eating more in tandem with your local season. I'm big into, especially at the start of Lent, when it's still just quite gray and it's kind of that blah time of year. That's, the holidays, the fun holidays have passed. It's still a ways away till the next bit. Using a lot of candles. Traditionally, the church also recognizes February 2nd as a holiday called Candlemas. And that is a holiday, some traditions still do this, but back in the day, parishioners would go to their local parish and their priest would bless their candles. And the idea being, may they, bless where they will be lit in terms of in your home, and literally, last longer, because this is their form of, electricity at the time. And so it was just recognizing, boy, this is the dead of winter, but it's not going to last much longer. Let's get through this. And so I think lighting candles is a fun way, especially in the Ash Wednesday and first few weeks of Lent. And then, just incorporating other ideas of maybe, like what I was saying earlier, a bit of the research of whatever it is you're going to fast from. Perhaps, let's say you are, just because it's easy, you're fasting to talk about fasting from some sort of food situation, perhaps watching a documentary about that that endeavor. Like, maybe you're fasting from meat. And so you watch a documentary about the meat industry or something like that. Depends on your kids' ages and depends on your interest and all that. But yeah, kind of embodying all of it makes not only makes the Lenten season more embodied, but it also in some ways adds some variety, adds some quote fun, for lack of a better word. If you're just thinking about what you're missing, you kind of forget that you are gaining something through your fast. You're gaining some added benefit, even if it doesn't feel like you are. And that makes it more real.
Yeah. I was actually, when my kids were little, when you were talking about the candles, it reminded me of this. I set up a little Lent station and they would come down in the morning or whenever throughout the day, and they would light a candle. And then I had these prayer cards and we had one for every day. So it was kind of adding in prayer, but lighting that candle, that symbolic piece. And it really was special. It was such a simple thing. And I actually put them on my website, the prayers, just because I had so many people ask about it. And it's crazy because so many people download them still. And I use them still, just even personally myself, but just that small ritual of candle prayer. I mean, even just adding that felt sacred and it felt beautiful.
Right. Which, something I think we like about Advent, the practice of lighting the candles, the countdown, adding something like that to Lent also feels countdownish in a fun, life-giving kind of way. I added a bit of that in my book by way of art and music, giving art to look at, giving a song to, a playlist that helps you count down. I think adding a lot of that stuff really does make it more kind of three-dimensional for our kids and for us.
So you've mentioned a few times giving something up. That makes me think, as a family, you give something up instead of everyone choosing their one thing that they are going to fast from, that as a family, you're collectively fasting from something like meat. Is that your practice, that as a family you choose something, or is it more of we're all going to pray about something that God is asking us to fast from?
It's 100%. It depends on the year. So there are times, as the parents, we might lead our kids through something if we really sense that this is something family wide, perhaps, especially if it truly involves it by way of what it is, it would involve them. Like my husband and I are the cooks. And so if it involves something related to food, they are just by proxy going to be affected by it. But other times it really is like a mix of things. And like I said, our kids are typical kids. And so they have some interest in this, but not all the time and not, gung ho about it. And so it really does depend on the year. We've had some years where, we are all collectively, it wasn't so much like we're all giving up sugar. I was giving up sugar. So therefore I'm not making desserts. I'm not buying sugar from the store. Therefore, neither are you really, perhaps, they might want to therefore try their hand at baking in the kitchen. And I wouldn't stop them because I'm not God, I'm not here to say, no, God has called you to this, that he has definitely called me to, unless I felt that way, truly hearing from God. But otherwise, it really is just year at a time, case at a time. I don't feel the need to be dogmatic about this is what we do here on out forever and ever, and kids change so much from year to year that you just never know.
I'm hearing throughout this interview, and I'm really appreciating this conversation of kind of this idea of sometimes you are taking something away and sometimes you're adding something in. And I do feel like there's this vice virtue play that happens. And it seems during Lent, most people see it as you take away a vice. So whatever your vice is, that's what you take away. But I'm hearing this virtue in there as well. Can you just kind of break those down for us and just talk to us about how Lent contains both?
Yeah. And that's exactly how I structured bitter and sweet, for that very reason, because I think it's so easy for us to focus on the vices, right? We are thinking about how we've screwed up, how frail we are in our bodies. And, while that is true, we tend to forget that the victory in Christ that we have means that we are actually capable of putting on holiness in a way that we would otherwise not at all be capable of without the grace of Christ. And that the church has long recognized corresponding vices and virtues, so that it's not all just dirge and here's what to avoid, but it's also, in a way, here's what to put on. As you take off these vices, put on these virtues. And so, the church historically has recognized 7 vices, not because they needed to have a definitive list. I mean, maybe they did in some ways, but that's just where they see all sin coming from, one of these 7 vices. And so in Bitter and Sweet, I go through some of these, but like an easy example is pride, right? Pride is kind of considered the vice of all vices, the capital vice, the capital sin. And while I explore that in the first little bit, when I'm talking about pride in the book, it only works in tandem with its virtue, because if you just think about only getting rid of pride, that leaves you hollow. In fact, the church also recognizes you can swing the other way to legalism, and pride without its corresponding virtue of humility actually leads to self-loathing, right? And which is actually another form of pride, actually self-loathing, not recognizing the beauty of how God's made you and the gifts God has given you is not a virtue at all. That is another form of pride. That's self-loathing. So we also need to put on the gifts that we are given, the ability to live life with humility. That is a gift that we can't do on our own. And so, same with like gluttony, when we focus so much on the, avoiding the things that we are tempted to hoard, or tempted to, what's the verb, to be a glutton about? I can't think of the verb, whatever that is. We end up swinging over to scarcity, a scarcity mindset of, and that's fear-based, right? When really the virtue is temperance, this idea of God has given us good things to feast on. And we should be so crazy thankful for chocolate, actually, so giving up the things that we're tempted towards isn't just about making us feel bad for being tempted to those things. Those are good things. In fact, I mean, really, the medieval Christians had a better idea of this, but historically speaking, the church has recognized sin as a distortion of a good. Like all sin is some form of a distorted good thing, and good things are from God. And so that's what we do as humans when we sin, is we really and truly are in search of God, just like St. Augustine talked about, that our hearts are restless until they rest in him. And so it does us all the good in the world when we recognize that we are really and truly in search of God himself. We're not just trying to get rid of our human vices, because that leaves us empty. Who wants a life of that, really and truly? The life of Christ is a life of abundance.
That is so rich, Tsh. Like what you just said right there, like that is so rich. And I mean, we think about anything right now. I mean, think about the computer. Just the computer alone, right? Like could be a blessing, but then we turn it into this vice. And there's just so much there. And I feel like in your book, it makes me want to go and just read those, what is the vice? What is the virtue that we need to put on to have that balance, to have that, like you said, that like the temperance. I mean, that's just so beautiful. And it's so true, it rings so true. Mm-hmm. And so I just, that is just so rich. Thank you for that. That's a gift.
Yeah. Yeah.
As we're kind of wrapping up today, and as we are looking at just how we can encourage people as they walk into Lent, what would you say to our listener who's like, okay, I'm going to give this a shot. I'm going to actually try and do this differently. I'm going to try and have maybe just a more centered approach to Lent this year. Just give a few suggestions and recommendations.
Well, one of the reasons I originally wrote my Advent book back in the day was because I couldn't find the thing I was looking for myself for my own family, which was something that was theologically rich and meaty, but also not a burden, not like one more thing to do. And that made me instantly feel behind if we didn't do, and also didn't require a lot of prep work on my part. I wanted something that was open and go. And so the same I find rings true for Lent. If we approach Lent like this, campaign, this battle campaign that we need to win, then we are just really going to burn out on the outset. So the first thing I tell someone, especially if they're new to this ancient practice, is to really give yourself a lot of grace and go easy on yourself. And it sounds weird, but try not to do, quote, too much. In my practice, like what I've written out in my book is that I give, through the 7 vices and virtues that we explore, a short thing to read, a short bit of scripture, a short question to ask yourself and pray, and then a piece of music to listen to. And then once a week, a piece of art to contemplate on. And what I tell people is, if you feel overwhelmed, to pick 2 of those things. So perhaps you practice the art of prayer. And so you really are focusing on these daily prayers, and you accompany that with the music or something like that. And then as you get into this habitual rhythm, add in some scripture reading. And the same goes for whatever you choose to fast from. Perhaps, it's not to say that God might not be calling you to something big and challenging, but because perhaps God is, right? And who am I to say? But, this isn't necessarily something that God is asking you to do, something that is inhuman. God doesn't really, God doesn't call us to fast from all food,
Mhm.
He might ask you to fast from a food or a meal or a way of eating, like restaurants or something like that. It might be something that's like a tech device or just a creature comfort. I know someone who fasted from her pillow for Lent. I know
Wow,
someone who
that's
fasted,
interesting.
from a mirror to where she didn't use a mirror for
Mm.
Lent. So there might be just small things. Ask God if you've just become unintentionally or intentionally overly dependent on something, and that what would be genuinely challenging but not burdensome. God's not asking us to put on a burden. And then ultimately, it sounds trite and cliche, but really and truly just ask God, what would you be calling me to? And I say that because every single year for me, I can think about, research, weigh the pros and cons of different ideas, and almost every time the fast that God calls me to is something that he just kind of slams into my mind when I'm least expecting it. Like while I'm showering or waiting in traffic, and I realize oh my goodness, that is actually supposed to be my fast this year. And at first it's a little bit of oh no, can that really be the voice of God? But then I pray about it a little longer and it's yep, that's what God is calling me to. And sometimes it's actually a fasting from a certain vice by way of practicing the virtue therein. So as an example, I'm pretty sure this year God is calling me to fast from acedia, which is the ancient word for laziness, sloth, really, by way of walking 10,000 steps a day. That's going to be my fast. So that is a fast. It's a fast from sitting around on the couch. And so perhaps it's not so much a fast from something good. It's a fast from something bad by way of practicing something good. So be open to whatever God leads you to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sustainable element, because our listeners are very busy women who have lives, and you said, don't try to do too much. I could see them conquering Lent and then doing so much that it takes over their lives, and then actually they won't be successful. Mm-hmm. So that's that's a good.
Exactly. I'm not running 3 miles a day. I'm walking 10,000 steps a day, and it's because it's an offering I'm giving to God. I'm hoping I can pray during that time. I'm hoping to welcome a lot more silence in my life. There's all sorts of side benefits besides just this, proving to myself that I'm worth it, or that I can do hard things. Well, that's part of it. That's not all there is. And if I swing too far to the other side into a form of unintentional legalism, then I miss out on those opportunities that God might want to use in other ways that I wouldn't expect.
Yeah. Be willing to be surprised by how God will use that.
That's right.
And as he invites you in to that space.
That's right. Yeah. Well said. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Tsh. I feel like you're really filling a gap here in Lent, in the Lenten season. And I'm really, really excited about this book and just about what you're bringing to the table. So thank you. It's a gift to all of us.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad to give it.
All right. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.